The cover shooter genre these days has a little bit of a stench to it, especially among hardcore gaming enthusiasts such as myself and my audience. But I think that stigma is somewhat misplaced because even though we got this trend of lame cover shooters that came out during the 360 era, Gears of War and so forth, I think it's important to remember that just because a trend emerges in a style of game design, that does not mean that that trend ultimately is the only endpoint of that style of game design, which seems to be kind of the way people discuss games these days. If you listen to discussions around cover shooters now, they're all basically just associated with Gears of War and if it's Gears of War or not. When really, if you look back to the lineage of the cover shooter, it has this very rich classical design lineage that's awesome, going back to rail shooters, gallery shooters, light gun games. There is a whole legacy of cover shooters that absolutely predate Gears of War, and Gears of War is just kind of the lame Western take on the cover shooter. But it's so successfully branded as the cover shooter these days that everything around this style of design just pivots on Gears of War to the point where a lot of early cover shooters are not only not appreciated, but they're not even recognized as cover shooters. Like, they don't even get credit for pioneering in this style of game design. And of course, hardcore gamers, because the cover shooter has fallen out of fashion, we're not really eager to classify these games as cover shooters ourselves because that's almost like kind of a diss. And you'll notice this among hardcore players and appreciators of fine game design, where if it's a good cover shooter, we kind of want to like push it into other genres away from what it actually is. Vanquish, I talked about this in the Vanquish video. Like, Vanquish is a cover shooter, especially when you play it at its highest difficulty, its truest mode, God hard, and this will translate to Dead to Rights, I promise. When you play it in that true form, its cover shooter dynamics become obvious. They become overwhelming and powerful. It's only when you play it on low difficulty that you see, oh yeah, you can kind of just do what you want and run around and use all these fun mechanics. But at its heart, in the DNA, it is a cover shooter. Same thing with Dead to Rights. Dead to Rights, if you go onto Wikipedia, and I know Wikipedia is not the bastion of great game design knowledge, but what else do we have these days? That's the funny thing, is as crappy as Wikipedia is, where else are you gonna go? IGN? Where are you gonna go for this information? So if you go and look at Wikipedia, it does not know how to classify Dead to Rights. It has no idea what genre this game is. It's like third person arcade action adventure shooter. None of the reviews knew how to classify Dead to Rights either. Even back then, they're like, it's like a third-person shooter, like Max Payne kind of, but there's these lock-on mechanics and cover mechanics. There's arcade stuff going on here, but we don't know what to say. But what I want to point out is I think it's important not to just push games in a certain genre into some other genre just because you don't like the main trend within that genre, because then you get to these really reductive discussions that cover shooters are lame. Well, let's get a little bit more nuanced here. The Gears of War style of cover shooter has problems, especially as the cover shooter has evolved. And what's funny is that the more evolved version of the cover shooter doesn't even get recognized anymore. Like, the guys who will sit and say, oh, cover shooters are shitty, I don't like cover shooters, will then turn and say, Last of Us is the greatest game of all time. Last of Us is a masterpiece of game design. It's like, what do you think The Last of Us is? Outside of all your little story stuff, what is the core gameplay of The Last of Us? It is the cover shooter. And of course, there's that stealth element, but you notice what basically happened with modern games now, modern third-person shooters and modern shooters these days, is they didn't inherit their modern third-person shooter style out of nowhere. It's basically a convergence of two different popular styles of game design during the PS2 era. The Namco cover shooter with Dead to Rights and Kill Switch. And if you think about it in terms of game design lineage, it makes a lot of sense that Dead to Rights is a cover shooter, considering the next game is Kill Switch. Those mechanics were set up in Dead to Rights. It's just they weren't recognized at the time. So you got the Namco cover shooter era, and then you've got the Konami Metal Gear Solid stealth style. So you get those two together. You put together the cover shooter with the Konami stealth action game, and you get essentially Metal Gear Solid 5, where despite all its issues with its open world and level design, pretty much everyone I've talked to, and myself included, agree the mechanics of that game's core gameplay is top notched. But where the cover shooter went wrong, I think, in the West, was the West's obsession and interest with realism and immersion, where instead of building on the natural strengths of the cover shooter, which is routing, spacing, enemy interaction, resource management, rather than focusing on the strengths and building on them, what Western developers decided to do is, now let's make this more clunky by adding in realism. So we're just going to slow down the pace of the game. We're going to make it more passive. Let's add some gunsway. Let's add some movement inertia. Let's incentivize you to just sit still and wait.
Hurry and wait.
That ends up being the design philosophy of a lot of these clunky cover shooters, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so I want to take a look back at Dead to Rights and show what this game is doing right by the genre and how a lot of its lessons have been lost with time. To begin with, there's a very interesting backstory of Dead to Rights that we need to discuss, which is that when the game was released, there were two different versions of the game. Technically, because it's a 6th generation game, there were more than 2 versions, but in terms of meaningful gameplay changes, there were 2 different versions. There was the launch Xbox version, and then the revised version that came out on everything else. And if you are familiar with Ninja Gaiden 2 and its release, this story is going to sound quite familiar to you, which is that when the Xbox version came out, turns out that the Xbox version was very difficult and very challenging, and there was a lot of complaints among game critics, and I'm assuming the general gaming public, that the game is too hard. We can't get through it. It's kicking our asses. It's too challenging. And so in order to help with sales and critical reception, they made the game significantly easier in the other versions of the game. And this persists to this day, by the way. This hasn't been re-examined other than here on this channel. If you look at IGN and modern discussion around this game to this day, most people say, oh, play the PS2 GameCube version because they're the better versions. Because what ended up happening, if you go back and revisit the Xbox version, is by tuning down the difficulty so much and making the game so much easier on the other consoles, it actually lost the identity of the gameplay. And for a long time, I actually played on the GameCube version because I had a GameCube. I loved the GameCube. I had all of them, but I loved the GameCube. So I played on the GameCube version for a very long time. And I liked Dead to Rights during this era. Everyone does. But it's kind of a more breezy romp, just running around, shooting people, dive in, slow motion, shadow the dog, get him. If you were to try to sit down and classify it or think about how is this game meant to be played in terms of how the mechanics come together, what is the identity of the game, you can just kind of roll through it and it's all good. But when I picked up the Xbox version of the game many years later to play on my Xbox 360, I all of a sudden was like getting obliterated and getting my ass kicked, and all of a sudden the gameplay seemed completely different to me. I was like, wait, how am I actually supposed to approach this? What am I supposed to do? So I had to think about it on my own, and I realized, oh, this is a cover shooter. All those mechanics it teaches you in the first stage, you know, the tutorial stage, those actually do matter. Those are actually important. And so when you go back through and you're playing the game on a higher difficulty, the design and mechanics and everything all of a sudden come into focus. Playing on low difficulty for a lot of games is like seeing them with blurry eyes, because even though you can kind of work your way through them and get to the end, you don't have a real clear focus of what the game is wanting you to do, because there's not a lot of consequences, there's not a lot of pressure, there's not trial and error and learning and routing and all that good stuff. Low difficulty is just kind of this blurry sense of the game design. And then once you pull that difficulty higher, that clarifies the design. It's like putting on a pair of glasses. All of a sudden you can see, oh, the cover mechanics matter. Oh, the range mechanics matter. Oh, the manual aiming mechanic matters. The entire time I played this game as a kid and as a teenager and even as a young adult, I never used the manual aiming mechanic. I just assumed, oh, you use it for a few puzzles here and there. No, it turns out it's a foundational key mechanic of the game that I never used because I never had to. All of these things start to matter. The spacing starts to matter. The cover system starts to matter. The human shield system starts to matter. All of it starts to matter when the difficulty is there because there's consequences, because you have to engage with the game on its terms. And that's such an important lesson because I think this is why Dead to Rights has not been classified as a cover shooter even to this day. It's because no one is engaging with it at that core level. Everyone's just like, forget that Xbox version. That was like a rough draft. Let's play the easy breezy PS2 version. But once you have to engage with the mechanics, you actually can see how innovative and well designed this game is. And so what I want to highlight is what we can still learn from Dead to Rights all the way back then, because it was doing a lot of stuff that I don't think has been picked up on or elaborated on all of these years later. And so let's begin by talking about the cover mechanic itself. The cover mechanic of this game is very interesting because there's a risk reward to it that emphasizes distance. And the way this risk reward works is that at high distances, the lock-on system doesn't function very well. Either it will not be able to lock on because they're just too far away, or the effective damage and range of the weapons won't work at that long of a distance. The way lock-on works is it's kind of like Ketsui, it's kind of like shmups. The closer you are to the enemy, the more damage the lock-on attack does. This is especially obvious with stuff like shotguns, but it's with all guns, basically. The closer you are, the more damage your lock-on will do. The further you are away, the less damage the lock-on will do. So you're actually kind of taught this indirectly in the opening tutorial stage, because what you do is that when enemies are outside of effective lock-on distance, then it's time to go into manual aim. But the trade-off of the manual aim is that the manual aim of this game, I'm actually a huge fan of, even though it's a little bit on the clunky, funky side in terms of the aiming itself. But the cool thing about it is because you have to hold still and go into this manual aiming style, it's specifically good only against long-ranged enemies, because up close, they're going to move around you. They're hard to keep a track of. It's hard to hit things up close that are moving with this manual aiming system, but things that are planted and further away, that's what it's for. And then as they get closer to you, then you need to go back into the lock-on system. That's where you can kind of get behind cover and you pop and shoot and use cover when they're kind of at the medium distance. But then as they get closer and closer, cover doesn't work super well up close because you're exposed on the other side of the cover. So if they get to the other side, they're going to light you up and kill you. So as they get closer, now you have to abandon cover and you have to go into more like organic, real spacing, ducking, moving around and trying to grab them for human shields and stuff. Basically, at long ranges, you need to use manual aiming, organic cover. At medium ranges, that's where you get context sensitive, get behind walls, pop and shoot. And then at close range, you got to get away from the manual cover again and get up close and personal and like circle strafe and try to grab them, right? So that's the cover shooting system and the lock-on system. And then complementing that, you have the weapon system. The weapon system of this game is surprisingly really well developed and thought out. I'm actually really impressed with how well done the weapon system of this game is, because the way the weapon system of this game works, that breaks that sort of just sit and wait type of mentality, is that you only get a certain amount of ammo of each weapon that you can hold, and the different weapon types have drastically different ranges, and you can't hoard weapons very well. You have to engage with the space of the area to attack enemies and also get weapon pickups and stuff. And the more you get comfortable with using the cover system, the range system, and the manual aiming system, the more you'll be able to navigate this game's weapon type. And I love the way it works because you have different weapon archetypes. On the ranged end, you have the extreme of the sniper rifle. And so when you first start playing, it seems like the sniper rifle is a really crappy weapon. And I remember as a teenager when I was playing on the GameCube version, I would actually intentionally shoot out all the bullets of the sniper rifle and just drop it because I thought it was actively just clunking up my inventory. But that's because the sniper rifle has a very special property, which is that it is garbage when locked on, but if you enter manual aiming mode and headshot, specifically headshot an enemy, it's a one-hit kill. But the cool thing about Dead to Rights is that enemies will move around and shift around. So trying to like manually hit them as they move is crazy hard to do, especially because this game has kind of a clunky manual aim type of feel to it. I kind of like it, but I will admit it feels a little funky. So the way it actually works is enemies have different patterns and different styles of attacking you, and they go into different modes, and you can kind of start to observe the way they move around. They'll periodically get behind cover, they'll pop out of cover themselves. And so if you start to route and understand the enemy AI and enemy behavior, what you can do, especially if you get a human shield, is you get an enemy in the distance, you fire up the scope and you zoom in, and then you kind of wait for them to go undercover, and then as they stick their head out, you just nail them. So that's one extreme of the weapon system, where it's very powerful at longer ranges with manual aiming. And then you get the other extreme of the weapon system with the shotguns and the Uzis, where they can't hit anything at a distance. They're completely useless in long-range situations, but up close and personal, especially if you have a human shield, they will obliterate enemies. And then you've got the mid-range stuff like the pistols and the assault rifles. And so what this translates to in terms of gameplay is you're constantly swapping your weapons dynamically as the enemies move around, as the environment changes, as you enter different rooms based off the size of the room. So in Chapter 4, Black Orchid, I believe it's called, there's a poker room that you go into that's really tight and close up, and you're going in there with shotguns and Uzis, up close and personal. Then as you get further in the game, you've got areas that are massively wide, like the docks, and you're going to deal with those docks using assault rifles and sniper rifles. And the way you have to constantly shift through the weapon types and negotiate the weapon type based off of the room size is very unique and cool, and something I think modern games really don't do anymore, because everything's all about using, the first person or like close up style aiming. Everything's all about that now, and it can't play with range as well as this game's lock-on system does, because of that natural trade-off of you can't just go through the game manual aiming because you can't move, it's slow, and you can't hit things while they're moving very well, and you'll get lit up. Like if you walk into a room and go into manual aim just out in the open, you're going to get obliterated. But what's really cool about the game's ranged weapon system is the way it feeds back into the cover system, where based off of the things in the room, based off of the enemy types, based off the weapon types, based off the size of the room, that really dynamically changes if you're going for cover, if you're crouching, if you're going to run and charge at things. You have to respond to the environment just as much as you have to respond to the enemies. And that is classic arcade style dynamics. That is Metal Slug style stuff. Metal Slug, you're at a distance, you're using the machine gun, you're up close, you're using the shotgun, you got the knife, grenades, all of that stuff is really well presented in Dead to Rights, but in a 3D environment. And I think that is a real strength of cover shooters that you just do not get in open combat style stuff, Doom and Quake, Devil Daggers even. As much as I like the movement-based, aiming-based style of boomer shooters, which is bullet hell-like in a lot of ways, I think it's important not to discount the strengths of this cover-based, environmentally based design as well. And the really genius aspect of this game's design, kind of like the hidden magic, is the final mechanic that I don't know if many other cover shooters have done. I'm not going to say no other cover shooters have done, because probably something else has used it, but I've never seen any game use it as well as Dead to Rights, which is the human shield mechanic. This mechanic is amazing, not only because it's cool, but also the way it solves a lot of interesting dilemmas in terms of cover shooter design. Because with a lot of cover shooters, in stealth games as well actually, they run into the problem of level design being stagnant and kind of prescribed, because if you just put a lot of enemies in an area and then put little patches of cover, how do you make it so it's not this prescribed procedural path of go here, kill the guys, go there, kill the guys, go there, kill the guys? There's different ways you can negotiate that, but one of the coolest ways is, well, why don't you make the enemies dynamic cover? Why don't you give cover AI that runs around and attacks you, but if you can leap out and grab it, catch it like a Pokemon, then all of a sudden you can turn an enemy into an asset. You can make the cover system dynamic and tied in with enemy behavior. That's why Dead to Rights Run to Run never feels stale and never feels the same, because a lot of your cover and routing has legs that can run around, and you have to negotiate with it. So when you come into a room and there's a ton of open space and enemy fire, you get to play this interesting risk and reward game where if you just take cover behind like a little box or something and wait, enemies will start to rush you. And if you get 2 or 3 of them up close behind your cover, it's over. Their damage is going to stack faster than you can deal with them, or you're just going to take a ton of damage in the process. So just sitting and waiting is not an option in a lot of cases because you're going to get rushed. But then trying to run out into open fire probably isn't a good idea either, because by the time you get to a better situation cover-wise, you're probably dead. So when the rubber hits the road, what do? Well, one very powerful technique is you bait in an enemy to come at you, then you run around the corner and grab them. And then once you have them as a human shield, not only have you neutralized them as a threat, but then what you can do is you can enter manual aiming mode while they're in human shield, and they're taking the oncoming fire, and then you can pick off the enemies at a distance while they're killing their ally as your human shield, and then get back behind cover. So this like luring and using people as shields and then entering manual aiming, that is a core gameplay dynamic and skill that, unless you're playing on high difficulty, you probably won't clue in on. And that's the shame of this game, because when you go through and read a lot of reviews, people talk about the diving system and the slow-mo system. But if you're playing on the real version of the game, diving is good if you're trapped in a corner, or if you open a door and there's like 6 guys with shotguns. Then the slow-mo dive and on certain boss fights and stuff is a very good routing tool. But if that's your core basis of engaging with the combat, if just running at people and diving at them, no, that's not going to work. And unfortunately, with the shifts in the PS2 and GameCube version, they specifically made the game to play like that, probably because feedback was, man, I really like it when you get to run at people and dive at them. That's so cool. It's like the Matrix. So just, I want that to work more. And the changes they made is they cut down on the amount of enemies, they cut down on the enemy health. And so if you run and dive at them, you can like kill 6 of them at once in the PS2 and GameCube version. In the Xbox version, you run and dive at them, and if there's like 6 of them, they'll just kill you in the air. You'll get 1 dead and the other ones will kill you. And what's interesting is that normally with modern design, I'm very much against enemies have higher health. You don't want that sort of bullet sponge type of problem. But Dead to Rights does something very cool, which modern games seem to have forgotten or don't use nearly as much anymore, which is something called Hitstun. GoldenEye is a beautiful example of what Hitstun can do. Do you ever sit and wonder, why does GoldenEye feel so good and modern shooters don't feel good? It's not just the movement speed, it's the Hitstun. GoldenEye has like insane amounts of Hitstun on the shots, and it feels awesome. And that's how you can get like 16 enemies in front of you, or how many the N64 can handle, like 10 or whatever. You get them all in front of you, and you can just spray them with the pencil gun and keep them in check. The reason you can do that is because of Hitstun. Dead to Rights has Hitstun, and it integrates beautifully with the human shield system. Point being, when you combine together the low ammo with the lock-on system, with the human shield system, with the cover system, you get a very dynamic style of gameplay that you're not going to really find in too many other places. And I wish we could have seen elaborated on a lot more, because it both rewards memorization with improvisation. You come into every room and every section of the game with a generalized route, but because of the dynamics of the enemy behavior, you have to react to what they're doing. You have to respond on the fly. So it creates this great replayability, and this is why Dead to Rights feels so replayable, because you improve, but you never totally solve all of the enemy encounters, which is a very arcade philosophy. And there's one last mechanic I just want to comment on real quick, then we'll get to my critiques and final conclusion. The one last mechanic I want to bring up is Shadow the dog. Now, when I was a kid and teenager, and I know a lot of my friends, we're all into Dead to Rights. We thought it was like the sickest game ever. I remember Shadow being such a fan favorite because it's really cool just aesthetically and conceptually that you have this police attack dog that you stick on enemies and it has this cool animation. I think the animation could be faster. Looking back on it now, I think it could be sped up. But still, it is a very cool concept, and it became like a signature standout feature of the series, funnily enough. But taking away all the aesthetics and all that cool stuff, the mechanic itself of Shadow is very clever and ties back into the overall cover design really well. And I know exactly where Shadow comes from, which is, okay, you have this cover-based shooter, but you've ran out of resources, which isn't that unlikely because, again, you have limited ammo counts. And so you got a situation where you've shot yourself out of ammo, you're stuck behind cover, and you're getting pinned down. What can you do? Like, what mechanic could they introduce to kind of get you out of these checkmate situations? Because what's cool about cover shooters is that they're so routing based that, you know, memorization and planning are really rewarded. But the trade-off is if you're not doing well with your routing and stuff like that, you can kind of checkmate yourself. And it's very interesting how different games tackle this scenario. Unfortunately, some cover shooters are just like, let's give you so much ammo that this will barely ever happen. But in Dead to Rights, it can happen all the time because, like I said, the ammo counts are so low, which I think is good. So they needed something, and that is Shadow. So the way Shadow works is he's on a timer, and then once the timer fills up, you can go out and he will auto-lock onto dudes, and then he's a one-hit kill. He goes and bites and eats the dude. But the key thing Shadow does is after the kill, he brings you back their gun. You're armed once more. You're back in the game, baby. Cover shooter, resume. That is key. That is actually a lot more important than getting the kill, because if you got 15 dudes on you, killing one of them, it would be lame if you had to just sit behind cover, wait for Shadow to recover, jump out, kill, wait behind to recover, jump out and kill. That would be monotonous, shitty, and lame. Namco knew that, so they needed to do something to get that gun to you. And so it's very interesting to think about. I don't have any research on this. If I could track down some of the developers and talk to them someday, this would be really cool to ask them. But I almost wonder if the entire like police theme of the game and the fact that you have a police dog, I wonder how much of that relates back to just contextualizing some way for a human dude to get a gun from another dude that's not totally implausible and weird contextually. The fact that a dog would attack him and then dogs fetch and the dog fetches you back the gun, that is a stroke of brilliance, because any other solution to that would be kind of ridiculous. Like, how else would Jack get that gun back to him? Like, he had some kind of whip like Wonder Woman, whoosh, pull the gun back. Like, contextually, how do you get that gun to come back to you? The dog is such a cool way to do that. And this is the type of game design that I always get really excited about. It's when you've got a really cool gameplay mechanic idea, or you have to solve a game design issue, but you need to contextualize it somehow visually. And that can be actually really tricky sometimes. And I wonder how much these days these types of game design problems feed back into most games being fantasy-based theming-wise. Because when you run into these kind of abstract problems with combat or level design, you can always just be like, well, it's a fantasy game, so magic. The power of magic or key or whatever to get these kinds of problems solved. But if you're going for a more like kind of realistic visual presentation, obviously the actual combat isn't realistic. It's John Woo, which I think is great. But in terms of the visual theming, Jack is not magic. So they need some way visually to sell that to the player. The dog, that's such a cool idea. And it would be fascinating to know how deep that goes back to the game design, or if they thought of a dog attacking enemies just independently and then realized, oh, we could use the dog to fetch the gun. These types of questions are the questions people should be asking game developers. Stop asking them about the stupid story. Ask them, did you come up with the dog to fetch the gun? Chicken and the egg situation. Was the dog created to fetch the gun, or do you need to fetch the guns because there's a dog? Which came first? Fascinating. But anyway, let's get to my critiques. So my main critique of Dead to Rights is actually very simple, which is that it does not have a performance style system. It needs something to recognize elevated gameplay beyond just survival, because the survival gameplay is so fun, so engaging. I sit down and look at the game after I beat it and I'm like, I want to play you again, Dead to Rights, and I want to play you maximum. I want to play you like a boss. Problem is, outside of doing a no-death run of the game, there's no real way to do that because, people speed run the game, and yeah, you could speed run, but I think there's a lot more you could do if it had a style system, if it had a performance system, especially if it connected back in with using human shields and disarms and shadow and all these different mechanics. If they could be tied together into like this coherent, cool play style that involved the performance system, I think that would really put Dead to Rights over the top. And it's a shame that this era of games, they don't get mods or hacks or anything like that. I just want that little extra something at the end, even if it's an additional difficulty mode. That's another thing. I was shocked. I beat the Xbox version, and the PS2 and GameCube version have a mode called Super Cop, which is the hard mode, which is still significantly easier than the Xbox version, by the way. But I wish the Xbox version had a higher difficulty mode. I wish it had its own Super Cop or hard-boiled mode, because even though it is challenging, there's still plenty of room for more challenge that would have gone a long way. And then on top of that, some cosmetic unlocks would be nice. And please, I wish we could skip the mini games on repeated playthroughs. Either just have that built in where you can skip them, or if you're doing the cheat code stuff, there's all these different cheat codes. Please have a cheat code that disables all the mini games, because they're not terrible or anything, but on repeated playthroughs, they really wear down the pace and just are filler. This is kind of the precursor to modern game design. Like you can see in the PS2 era, we're hitting the beginning of this stuff, which I'm not a fan of. And this will continue to build as we get further and further out. But yeah, the mini games, get rid of them, make them skippable on repeated playthroughs. They're just gunking up the core gameplay design, and not a huge fan of them. So final thoughts on Dead to Rights. This is a cult classic, in my opinion. I've been a fan of it since childhood, and it is an effective game at bridging the gap between sort of the arcade hardcore player base and the modern casual player base, at least back then. And I really love this sort of midsection of the PS2 era. Your Max Paynes, your early Grand Theft Autos, your Dead to Rights, Kill Switch, Gungrave. These games in this era that were kind of bridging that gap between the arcade and the casual Metal Gear as well. And then as we get further out, you can see the rift getting wider and wider, where the arcade side keeps getting eliminated more and more, and the modern stuff keeps expanding bigger and bigger. But this era, I think, is really special. And I think there's a lot to learn from this era even now, where this style of game design still holds up now. And if we can kind of deprogram this idea that having more direct mechanics and having more direct interactions is somehow archaic and not things that people will love, I think we will start to see more of those mid-core crossover games I'm a huge fan of, that I'm going to cover more on the channel. And speaking of more on the channel, if you enjoyed this review, I definitely recommend you check out my Vanquish review, which is another fellow slightly misunderstood but awesome cover shooter. And you'll see a lot of parallels between Vanquish and Dead to Rights, actually, where they're not exactly the same, obviously, but they're trying to do something cool and interesting with this cover shooter formula that I am a big fan of. And the era of full-time Electric Underground is upon us. I'm going full-time next month. So if you can, I'd really appreciate you help support the channel, support the Patreon, trying to make this as sustainable as possible. And I appreciate you all tuning in. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100 Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Ali Hashmi, Dingo, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Alai, Autonamed, Beelit, Beam Pit, Bo, Beeto Dames, Blade Symphony, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Chad Memphis, Chase Palumbo, Shay Phillip, Chronic Burnout 3, Christopher R, Clara Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Cooksand666, Cook Some Soup, Corio, Crump 12, Des Audio, DRK, Dances with Incels, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Andrus, David Crespo, Delta 6, Demian Smirnov, The Solus, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Edvard, Elbin Senisev, Eleanor Moon, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, Evie Zerker, Falcus, F Deluxe, Fenech, Friskin, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Retro Schmupper, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hack, Hans Kowalski, Hausu, Hero Death, Hiki Hime, Hunharthy, Hud, Humongous, J-Dab, Jake Ryan, Jurgen, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JBRPG, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, Gameboy Guru, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, K, K2, Contain, Praise the Boys, Ludwa, Lord Harrington, Lorian, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Sloan, Mars Bar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Mechororca, Minong, Meister, Metal Slime Drummer, Mewjam, Michael Del Polito, Malcolm McCord, Milady, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Morag, Monroe, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Perro, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Porol, Pedro Usilis, Phil Oz, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, Psycho Blizzard, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Raul, Rapido, RC, Real Scheme, Brent Pulse Time, Retrojet, Retro Schmupper, Ricky, Riff Mason, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Salmon Connections, San Nevo, Scanline City, Segfault, Shantak, Jazzy, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, Sirapong, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Stepalable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tim French, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Sugumo, 2YU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Unicorn Roots, Ursula, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Verena, Wabby Legs, What Is This, Zachary Patton, Zeal, Zeno, and Zenryoku.